The smell hit me before I even got out of the cruiser copper, and something older than that something the heat had been cooking all day against the white clapboard siding of the Duval house July in Calhoun County smelled like cut grass and diesel, and other people's misery, and I'd been smelling it for 19 years with a badge on my chest. But this was different. This was the kind of smell that made your hand find your hip before your brain told it to. I sat in the car for a moment. Hell, I am getting ahead of myself. The call had come in at 6:47 that Tuesday morning, which meant Darlene Fitch at the dispatch desk had been listening to her scanner while she ate her toast, and whatever she heard through the static was bad enough to call me directly instead of running it through Deputy Reeves. Darlene had been doing this job since Eisenhower. She didn't rattle when her voice came through the phone, with that particular flatness, not scared, just empty, the way a woman gets when she's decided something. I was already pulling on my boots. The Duval place, she said, on Simmons Road. I knew the house, knew the man who lived in it too. Calvin Duval, 41 years old, owned the grain elevator over on Route 9, the one his daddy had built in 1948, and left him along with 12 acres of bottomland, and a reputation that fit him like a suit he hadn't earned. He served on the Methodist Church board, coached Little League 2 seasons back before his knee went. Bought coffee for deputies when he came through town, always with that big open hand on your shoulder. Always with the laugh that was just a half-second too loud. Always thought there was something rehearsed about Calvin Duval. Couldn't tell you what exactly. Call it 19 years of watching people perform themselves for an audience. His wife was named Ruth. I knew less about her, which itself told me something. 3 neighbors had called overnight the Pickett family to the North Old Gordon Marsh, who was half-deaf, but apparently not deaf enough, and a woman named Soledad Ramos who worked mornings at the diner and lived in the rental house at the end of the Duval's gravel drive. All 3 had heard screaming, not the argument kind, the other kind. I got out of the cruiser. The porch steps had been recently painted gray, careful 2 coats. By the look of it, flower boxes under the windows, red geraniums, starting to wilt in the heat. Wind chimes made from old spoons. Everything about the exterior of that house said, "We are fine here, nothing to see, look at our geraniums." I knocked. The wait was long enough that I counted it 11 seconds. Then the sound of something being moved, furniture maybe, or a body adjusting itself against furniture, and then the door opened 4 inches, held by a chain. The eye that looked at me through the gap was dark brown and very still. "Mrs. Duval," I said. "I am Sheriff Harlan Cruz. I'd like to talk with you if that's all right." The stillness behind the door was its own kind of answer. She didn't say it wasn't all right. She didn't say anything for long enough that I started cataloging what I could see: a sliver of kitchen behind her yellow wallpaper with small daisies, a calendar on the wall open to July, and her face. What I could see of it, I could be wrong about the exact count of days, but the bruising around her left eye looked to be maybe 5-6 days old. Yellow at the edges, grape dark in the center. "My husband isn't home," she said finally. "I know I am here to see you." Another pause. Then the chain came off. She opened the door and stood back, and I saw the rest of it, the way she moved, slow, protective of her left side, the kind of careful that lives in a person's body long after the immediate damage is done. She was 37. I'd find out later, though she looked older in the particular way that stress ages a woman differently than time does. Brown hair pulled back, house dress, bare feet on linoleum. She had a quality of absolute self-containment, like a person who had spent years making herself take up as little space as possible. She didn't offer me coffee. She stood near the kitchen counter with her arms folded across her stomach and watched me come in, and I noticed she positioned herself so the counter was at her back. Old habit of a person who learned to not let things approach from behind. The neighbors called in some concerns. I said about noise last night, and before we had words she said, "It wasn't anything, Mrs. Duval." Ruth, I kept my voice where I learned to keep it low level, not gentle exactly. Because gentle can read as weak, and weak doesn't help a woman who needs to trust you. I've been doing this job a long time. I am not here to make trouble for your household. I am here because it is my job to make sure you ray all right, and right now looking at you I don't think you are. She looked at me steadily, no tears. That was the first thing that didn't add up, and I filed it away without knowing yet why it mattered. A woman in her situation, a stranger on her doorstep, referencing what everyone had heard. Most of them cried or looked like they wanted to. Ruth Duval just looked at me like she was calculating something. I fell. She said, Lord, I'd heard that one so many times. The words had worn smooth as river rock. Ruth, I understand you want to explain. What I am asking about is whether you raise safe in this house. I am fine. Where is your husband this morning? Something moved across her face, fast like a cloud shadow across a field. He had business in Millhaven. He left early. What kind of business? Grain business. He has contacts over there. I nodded, looked around the kitchen, the way I learned to look not at what was there so much as what wasn't. The kind of house where the walls told you things if you paid attention. A dent in the plaster near the refrigerator, old enough to have been painted over twice, but not quite hidden. A crack in one of the cabinet door panels that ran straight, the kind of crack that comes from impact rather than settling. The spoon drawer not quite closed, hanging open an inch, and when I looked closer I saw the runner was bent like it had been pulled hard and fast, the way you pull something when you need something inside it quick. Hell, I shouldn't have noticed that yet. I wouldn't have, except for what I found out later. But memory does that, rearranges itself around what turned out to matter. I asked Ruth Duval if I could sit down. She said yes. Surprised by the question, I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat in it, and just stayed there for a moment without talking, which is an old trick, and not a manipulative one. Sometimes silence is the only hospitality a person in crisis can accept. She stayed standing. Then slowly, like she was arguing with herself about it, she pulled out the chair across from me and sat. She kept her arms folded. How long have you lived in Calhoun County? I asked. 11 years. We moved here when Calvin got the elevator from his father. You from around here? Originally Tennessee, small town outside Knoxville. You have family there? The calculating look again. My mother, a sister. When did you last see them? She opened her mouth and closed it. Then 3 years ago. I let that sit. 3 years was a particular kind of distance when you lived 40 minutes from the Tennessee border. 3 years was a choice someone had made, and I doubted it was hers. Mrs. Duval, Ruth, I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen to it, even if you can do anything with it today. I leaned forward, forearms on the table, and I kept my eyes on hers. Whatever you've been told about what I can and can do about what will happen if somebody official gets involved, I want you to think about whether Calvin is the one who told you that something happened in her eyes. Not tears, just a shift like a door that wasn't locked, swinging slightly in a draft. He has friends, she said quietly, in the county. I know. He does the bank, the assessor's office. I understand you don't, she said. And it wasn't hostile, it was patient, with the patience of someone who had thought about this more than I ever would. Sheriff, those men have been to our house for dinner. They've sat in those chairs. Calvin, he knows how to make people. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He knows how to be what they want to see. I know what he knows how to do. I said, I've met the man. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that I didn't understand until 2 days later, when everything cracked open and the thing underneath it showed itself. She said, quiet and flat, and with a certainty that didn't belong to a conversation about a bruised eye and screaming neighbors, you should look at his books. I started to ask what she meant. A car turned onto the gravel drive. Ruth Duval's face went a stone. Not fear, exactly, something past fear, something that's been through fear so many times it's become a different material. She stood up from the chair without a sound and moved to the counter end. By the time the car door slammed outside, she was standing with her back to the room filling the kettle from the tap, and you would v thought I'd stopped by to borrow a cup of sugar. The door opened, and Calvin Duval walked into his kitchen, and he was smiling before he fully cleared the threshold, because Calvin Duval was always smiling. And for one long second before his eyes found me, I watched his face the way you watch something before it knows you. Watching the smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. Sheriff Cruz, he said, warm and broad as a July sky. Well, ILLB Ruthie, did you offer the man coffee? The kettle Ruth had filled was already on the burner, though she hadn't turned it on. Small detail. The kind of thing you notice when you looking at a person pretending to do something instead of actually doing it. Calvin, I said, and stood up from the chair, not fast, not slow, just stood the way you stand when you want a man to understand that you comfortable. And he isn't. I thought you had business in Millhaven this morning. Not a flicker I'll give him that the man had a face like a campaign poster. All surface, all confidence, assembled for public viewing, finished up early. Didn't he want Ruth alone with this heat? He moved to the refrigerator, pulled it open, stood in the cold air like a man with nothing on his mind. What brings you out our way, Harlan? He used my first name, of course he did. Neighbor concerns. I said noise complaints, wanted to make sure everything was all right out here. Noise. He let the word out slowly like he was tasting. It pulled a bottle of sweet tea from the shelf, held it up toward me in offering. I shook my head. Well, Ruth and I had ourselves a disagreement couple nights back. Married people do. He looked at her back with an expression I was meant to read as affectionate. Don T. We hun. She didn't turn around. Yes. She said to the wall, to the kettle. Didn't he mean to disturb the neighbors? He twisted the cap off the bottle. I'll walk over and apologize to Gordon personally. Man s sensitive on account of his wife passing. I should been more mindful. It was a masterwork, honestly. Offense converted to community concern in under 30 seconds. He already framed it, packaged it, handed it back to me with a bow. This was a man who been practicing that particular move for a long time. Ruth mentioned you have contacts in Millhaven. I said grain business, feed co. op, mostly few independent buyers. He took a long pull of the tea. Nothing exciting. Which co-op? Another fraction of a pause there, and gone like a skip on an AM station. Cumberland. Agricultural. You know it. I didn't but I wrote it down right there in my notebook, and I made sure he could see me write it. Something changed in his breathing. Almost nothing, but I'd been in rooms with liars for 19 years, and a man's breathing tells you things his face has learned to hide well. I said, capping my pen. I appreciate your time, Ruth. I looked at her, still facing the counter, the kettle still cold. You need anything, you call the department. Doesn't matter what time. She said nothing, but her shoulders moved, something small and involuntary, the way a person flinches at a kindness they've stopped expecting. I walked out into the July heat and sat in my cruiser for a moment before starting it in the rear view. I could see the front of the house, the geraniums, the carefully painted porch steps, the wind chimes moving in the dead still air, even though there wasn't any wind to speak of then. I realized they weren't wind chimes. One of the spoons was vibrating against the others from the force of a door being closed hard on the inside of the house. I started the engine and pulled out onto Simmons Road and drove 2 miles before I pulled over again and sat with the engine running and thought about what Ruth Duval had said. You should look at his books. Not help me, not he hits me, not I am afraid. Those were the things a woman in her position was supposed to say, the things the situation called for. Instead, she'd given me something oblique and specific, and she'd given it to me in the approximately 45 seconds between deciding to trust me and deciding she couldn't afford to. That wasn't desperation talking, that was information, placed deliberately by a woman who had been thinking about this for a long time and had decided in one unguarded moment at a kitchen table to hand me the corner of a thread. I need to tell you something about Calvin Duval's reputation in this county that reframe what I've told you so far, because I was operating on incomplete information for the first 48 hours, which is the kind of thing that can get a person killed, though in this case, it didn't barely. Everyone in Calhoun County knew Calvin as a successful man, grain elevator, bottomland, church, board, little league. What fewer people knew, what I'd known in the vague way you know things about prominent local men, without ever examining it, was that Calvin's operation had grown considerably in the past 3 years. New equipment at the elevator, a new truck, Ford F-250 custom cab, renovations to the house on Simmons Road, the porch steps and the flower boxes, and 2 new windows in the back. For a grain elevator in a county that hadn't had a particularly good yield in recent memory, I noticed it the way you notice whether registered it, found it unremarkable, moved on. That's the thing about a man who spends years building a face for people to look at. You end up looking at the face instead of the arithmetic. I drove back to the department and I called a man I knew at the county assessor's office, not the assessor himself, who, as Ruth had noted, was a dinner guest of the Duvals, but a woman named Pat Gentry, who worked the records room for 12 years and owed me nothing, and told the truth as a point of personal pride. Calvin Duval's property filings. I said last 3 years, any amendments, any secondary parcels, anything that moved. She called me back in 40 minutes. He's got a storage facility registered as an agricultural outbuilding, she said. Filed 18 months ago out on the back acreage, about a quarter-mile off the main parcel. There's no elevator equipment listed in the permit. What is listed? Climate control, she said. Humidity regulation, concrete floor poured after the fact. I thanked her and sat with that for a while. A grain outbuilding with climate control and humidity regulation in Calhoun County in 1974 that told you one of maybe 3 things, and 2 of them were legal. I called a friend at the DEA field office in Nashville. Not an official call, just 2 men talking about agricultural infrastructure in rural counties and what certain kinds of storage modification tended to indicate in their experience. He used the word processing and he used the word distribution, and he told me that Cumberland Agricultural Co-op in Millhaven had come up in a conversation he had 6 months ago that he wasn't at liberty to detail, but that he remember my name if I came across anything concrete. I went home that night and I didn't sleep much. This is the part I've turned over in my mind more than any other even now, because what I knew by Tuesday evening was enough to get a warrant started, enough to make calls, enough to put something official in motion. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing yet, was that Ruth Duval had been inside whatever Calvin was running for 3 years, not as a participant, but as a witness, an involuntary one, and that the bruising I'd seen was not the consequence of a marital disagreement, but of a woman who had 3 weeks prior told her husband she was going to take their car to visit her mother in Tennessee, and hadn't come back for 4 days. Where she'd gone in those 4 days, I found out later. What she'd done there, I found out later. The point right now is what it meant about Ruth, because it recontextualized everything I thought I'd seen at that kitchen table, everything I'd read as passivity or fear, or the particular resignation of an abused woman. She wasn't passive. She'd been building something slowly in the only direction available to her, which was sideways and underground and invisible, the way things grow when they were not allowed to grow upward. She'd made 2 trips to the Knoxville field office of the FBI in 14 months. Twice she'd sat across from agents. She'd cold contacted through a phone number she'd found in a library reference book, and she'd told them what she knew about her husband's operation, and twice she'd been told that without physical evidence or corroborating testimony, there wasn't enough to move on. She'd gone back to Simmons Road, both times back to the yellow wallpaper and the bent drawer runner, and the man with the campaign poster face. What I'd read as her placing a thread in my hand was actually something more deliberate than that. She'd been waiting for someone with county authority who wasn't already in Calvin's orbit, someone local enough to access the property, without a federal paper trail that Calvin might hear about through his contacts before anything moved. She'd done her research on me the way careful person researches anything when they have nothing but time and a local newspaper archive. Harlan Cruz, elected 3 times, no known social relationship with the Duvals, had arrested a county commissioner's son 7 years back and not lost a night's sleep over it. She'd chosen me specifically. And I'd walked in there thinking I was responding to a noise complaint. I pulled a warrant together by Thursday. Judge Elma Pierce signed it at 8 a.m. And she did it with the particular decisiveness of a woman who had her own dealings with powerful local men. And didn't need extra convincing when the evidence was solid. We went out to the back acreage at 10 a.m. with 2 deputies and a state narcotics officer named Bevel who'd driven up from the Capitol the night before. The outbuilding was exactly where the permit said it was: concrete block metal roof, a commercial-grade door, with a padlock that cost more than most men in this county made in a month. What was inside it, I won't describe in full, partly because the case record is public and anyone curious can find the details, and partly because some things you see in the course of this work are better carried quietly than narrated. I'll say it was enough for federal involvement by the end of the day. Enough to explain the new truck and the porch steps, and the contacts in Millhaven. Enough to explain why Calvin Duval had needed his wife to stay exactly where she was, seeing exactly nothing, saying exactly nothing for 3 years. He underestimated her. That was his real crime, if you want to talk about crimes beyond the legal catalog of them. He looked at a woman he systematically cut off from her family and her agency and the simple right to move through the world without calculating consequences, and he decided she was contained. He confused her silence for incapacity. Calvin Duval was arrested at the grain elevator at 11:40. That Thursday morning, Deputy Reeves handled it, which felt right. Reeves had grown up in this county and had watched Calvin sponsor the 4th of July fireworks for 6 years running, and deserved the satisfaction of putting the cuffs on. Calvin said nothing when they went on. He looked at Reeves, and then he looked somewhere past him at something neither of them could see, and his face did something complicated that I watched from 20 feet away and still couldn't entirely read, not the campaign poster anymore. Something older and rower than that, some original face he'd been covering up for so long. It didn't know what expression it was supposed to make. Ruth was at the county services office by noon that day, sitting across from a caseworker I trusted named Dorothy Hensley, who had a gift for making people feel like the walls were in closing in. ID called ahead. ID also made a call to a woman I knew who ran a program out of the First Baptist in Millhaven that nobody advertised openly, but that everyone in county services knew about: transitional housing, legal resources, the kind of unglamorous essential infrastructure that held women together while the official machinery caught up with their situations. I didn't see Ruth again until the preliminary hearing in September. She was sitting behind the prosecution table in a blue dress, hair down, and she looked, I don't know exactly how to say this without it sounding like more than it was. She looked like a woman who had recently remembered that she had a face that belonged to herself. She looked like someone returning from somewhere very far away. She didn't look at Calvin when they brought him in. She looked at the window, which in that particular courtroom faced east, and the morning light came through it at a low angle and caught the side of her face. And she sat there very straight and very still and looked at the light. She testified for 2 hours. She was precise and she was unsparing, and she didn't cry, same as she hadn't cried at the kitchen table. And this time I understood it. This wasn't the absence of feeling. This was what it looked like when a person had decided they were done spending resources on grief that belonged to their abuser. She grieved already privately on her own time. In whatever small hours were available to her, what she brought to that courtroom was something harder and more useful. Calvin Duvall got 18 years federal plus state charges that added a decade on top. The Cumberland agricultural connection unraveled 4 other operations across 3 counties over the following year, which is a story for another time. I think about Ruth, sometimes the way you think about the cases that rearranged something in you. Mostly I think about that moment at the kitchen table, her folded arms, her calculated stillness. The thing she said before the gravel crunched under his tires: "You should look at his books." 4 words carrying 3 years of waiting in them. 4 words from a woman who had nothing but time and silence and a library reference book, and the specific undefeatable stubbornness of a person who has decided somewhere very deep down that they are not finished. There's a verse I learned young, Proverbs, that my grandmother kept on a needlepoint above her kitchen door: "The wicked flee when no man pursueth it goes, but the righteous are bold as a lion." I am not man who invokes scripture casually, but I've thought about it in relation to Ruth Duvall more than once, because what she did, the FBI visits, the waiting, the choosing of me, the thread placed in my hand at exactly the right moment, that wasn't fleeing, that was a woman standing her ground on terrain so narrow it was almost invisible. The righteous don't always look like what you expect. Sometimes they look like a woman with her back to the room, filling a kettle from the tap, pretending she doesn't know a thing.